first of all, calls in Parliament today for a complete change in the way our economy works. Rather than focusing on GDP, a well-being economy could prioritise people and the planet. So what do our guests make of this? Mike Berners-Lee, those who are pushing this idea of a well-being economy say that the UK economy at the moment is set up to benefit the few at the expense of the planet. Is that really fair?
Yeah, I mean, we talk about the response to climate change often as if it's some kind of hair shirt we're all going to have to wear. And it's so not right. If we get this right, there's an opportunity as we go on top of climate change to all live better than we've ever lived, and not least by pursuing things that are actually in the best interests of people and planet. And GDP was actually never intended to be the metric that we guide our economy by. But we've kind of slipped into using it. And it's such a bad proxy for anything that's actually in our interests to pursue. So just making that simple shift away from being locked into GDP into just pursuing metrics like human well-being, environmental well-being, it sounds so obvious, but I mean, that's would be critical for us, will be critical for us.
And Tessa, I can see you nodding, and yet there will be people that say, what's wrong with GDP? What's wrong with a bit of growth? Isn't that what pulls people out of poverty? Now, Tessa, I can't hear you.
Apologies. I was just going to say, Anna, that I think the problem with GDP is that as a number on its own, it tells you nothing at all about how gains or growth is distributed, actually. And we know that, figures that showed an increase in GDP after the financial crisis didn't illustrate that most of those gains went to the already wealthy, and that those weren't distributed in a way that increased equality in our society. But I mean, to give you a more concrete example of why looking at GDP or production alone doesn't tell you anything about how close we are to tackling the climate crisis. I mean, one thing that the UK produces a lot of, which would look great on a GDP-focused spreadsheet, is oil and gas. And yet we know, according to the International Energy Agency, that we can't have any new production of oil or gas if we're going to stay within safe climate limits. So clearly GDP alone is not going to tell us what we need to know in terms of shifting away from those really damaging practices and industries in our society.
And Mike, it's not necessarily a new idea. I know in his review early this year, Professor Sapatha Dasgupta said that his overarching aim is the reconstruction of economics to include nature as an ingredient. But don't ideas like that involve huge societal changes that could take generations? And actually, we need action now.
Yeah, that's right. And the idea has been around for decades at least. And, as I said before, GDP was never even intended to be, the ultimate thing that economists pursue. So, and we do need really urgent change right now. But the good news is that, it is possible. It feels like we've been locked into this weird GDP simplistic metric, but just to give an idea of how useless it is. So if you create a society, for example, where nobody does anything for free to help their friends or their neighbors, and they charge for everything, then it's obviously a worse society to live in, but actually GDP goes up. Whereas if you create a society where people look after their neighbors just because it's a nice thing to do, GDP, and do things for free for each other, GDP actually goes down, but the well-being of people and probably planet goes up with it. So it's completely inadequate. And, it's unsurprising to see that actually to date, as GDP has grown, actually so have all our environmental impacts. So it's a big change because we're so locked into many of the ways that we think about the economy. But I think more and more people are realizing that change is what we need to make.
So Tessa, something that people might want to aspire towards, give us very briefly, if you can, a little vision of what it could look like and how quickly we could make changes.
Well, I think there are a lot of great proposals for alternative ways of assessing the health of our economies and societies and making sure that we live within planetary boundaries. But I think it is worth emphasising that while we encourage and embrace those really systemic shifts, there are all sorts of very obvious steps that governments in particular could take right now to ensure that we do keep living within planetary limits. And one of the things that Caroline Lucas highlighted is that governments are currently, including the UK government, is currently subsidising fossil fuel production, oil and gas production, to the tune of billions of pounds. And that if they were to stop doing that right away, that would, vastly improve our chances of being able to stay within those limits.
And of course, world leaders all signed up to reducing inefficient subsidies, didn't they, at COP? So perhaps that will happen.